Comics is a visual medium used to express ideas via images, often combined with text or visual information. Comics frequently takes the form of juxtaposed sequences of panels of images. Often textual devices such as speech balloons, captions, and sound effects indicate dialogue, narration, or other information. Elements such as size and arrangement of panels control narrative pacing. Cartooning and similar forms of illustration are the most common image-making means in comics. Fumetti is a form which uses photographic images. Common forms of comics include comic strips, editorial and gag cartoons, and comic books. Since the late 20th century, bound volumes such as graphic novels, comics albums, and tankōbon have become increasingly common, and online webcomics have proliferated. The history of comics has followed divergent paths in different cultures. Some scholars have posited a prehistory as far back as the Lascaux cave paintings. By the mid-20th century, comics flourished particularly in the US, Western Europe, and Japan. European comics traces its history to Rodolphe Pfeffer's cartoon strips of the 1830s, and became popular following the 1920s success of strips such as The Adventures of Tintin. American comics emerged as a mass medium in the early 20th century with the advent of newspaper comic strips. Magazine-style comic books followed in the 1930s. Japanese comics and cartooning traces its history to the 13th century. Modern comic strips emerged in Japan in the early 20th century in imitation of Western strips, and by the 1930s comics magazines and book collections became common. The post-World War II era saw the popularity of cartoonists such as Osamu Tezuka led to rapid expansion of the popularity of comics in Japan. Comics has had a lowbrow reputation for much of its history, but towards the end of the 20th century began to find greater acceptance with the public and within academia. The English term comics derives from the humorous work which predominated in early American newspaper comic strips. Usage of the term has become standard also for non-humorous works. It is common in English to refer to the comics of different cultures by the terms used in their original languages, such as manga for Japanese comics, or bandes dessinées copyrighted for French-language comics. There is no consensus amongst theorists and historians on a definition of comics. Some emphasize the combination of images and text, some sequentiality or other image relations, and others historical aspects such as mass reproduction or the use of recurring characters. The increasing cross-pollination of concepts from different comics cultures and eras has further made defining the medium difficult. Origins and traditions. Early examples of comics. The European, American and Japanese comics traditions have followed different paths. Europeans have seen their tradition as beginning with the Swiss Rodolphe Pfeffer and the German Wilhelm Busch, while Americans have seen the origin of their tradition in Richard F. Outcault's 1890s newspaper strip The Yellow Kid, though many Americans have come to recognize Pfeffer's precedence. Japanese comics had a long prehistory of satirical cartoons and comics leading up to the World War II era. Manga, the Japanese term for comics and cartooning, was first popularized by the artist Hokusai in the early 19th century. It is in the post-war era modern Japanese comics began to flourish, when Osamu Tezuka produced a prolific body of work. Towards the close of the 20th century, these three traditions have converged in a trend towards book-length comics, the comics album in Europe, the tankōbon in Japan, and the graphic novel in the English-speaking countries. Outside of these direct genealogies, comics theorists and historians have seen precedents for comics in the Lascaux cave paintings in France, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Trajan's column in Rome, the 11th-century Norman Bailly tapestry, the 1370 Bois Pratat woodcut, the 15th-century Ars Moriendi and block books, Michelangelo's The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and William Hogarth's 17th-century sequential engravings, amongst others. English-language comics. Illustrated humor periodicals were popular in 19th-century Britain, the earliest of which was the short-lived The Glasgow Looking Glass in 1825. The most popular was Punch, which popularized the term cartoon for its humorous caricatures. On occasion the cartoons in these magazines appeared in sequences. Ally Sloper featured in the earliest serialized comic strip when the popular character was granted a weekly magazine in 1884. American comics developed out of such magazines as Puck, Life, and Judge. The success of illustrated humor supplements in the New York World and later the New York American, particularly Outcourt's The Yellow Kid, led to the development of newspaper comic strips. Early Sunday strips were full-page and often in color. Between 1896 and 1901 cartoonists experimented with sequentiality, movement, and speech balloons. Shorter, black-and-white daily strips began to appear early in the 20th century, and became established in newspapers after the success in 1907 of Bud Fisher's Mutt and Jeff. Humor strips predominated at first, and in the 1920s and 1930s strips with continuing stories in genres such as adventure and drama also became popular. Thin periodicals called comic books appeared in the 1930s, at first reprinting newspaper comic strips. By the end of the decade, original content began to dominate. The success in 1938 of Action Comics and its lead hero Superman marked the beginning of the golden age of comic books, in which the superhero genre was prominent. The popularity of superhero comic books declined following World War II, while comic book sales continued to increase as genres such as romance, westerns, crime, horror, and humor proliferated. Following a sales peak in the early 1950s, the content of comic books was subjected to scrutiny from parent groups and government agencies, which culminated in Senate hearings that led to the establishment of the Comics Code Authority self-censorship body. The code has been blamed for stunting the growth of American comics and maintaining its low status in American society for much of the remainder of the century. Superheroes re-established themselves as the primary comic book genre by the early 1960s. Underground comics challenged the code and readers with adult, countercultural content in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The underground gave birth to the alternative comics movement in the 1980s and its mature, often experimental content in non-superhero genres. Comics in the U.S. has had a lowbrow reputation stemming from its roots in mass culture. Cultural elites sometimes saw popular culture as threatening culture and society. In the latter half of the 20th century, popular culture won greater acceptance, and the lines between high and low culture began to blur. Comics, however, continued to be stigmatized, as the medium was seen as entertainment for children and illiterates. The graphic novel book-length comics began to gain attention after Will Eisner popularized the term with his book A Contract with God. The term became widely known with the public after the commercial success of The Moss, Watchmen, and The Dark Knight Returns in the mid-1980s. The 21st century saw graphic novels become established in mainstream bookstores and libraries, and webcomics became common. Franco-Belgian and European comics. The francophone Swiss Rodolphe Tar Paragraph PFFER produced comic strips beginning in 1827, and published theories behind the form. The German Wilhelm Busch created comics from 1858 on, and was a source for future generations of comic artists. The Katzenjammer Kids was inspired by Busch's Max und Moritz. Cartoons appeared widely in newspapers and magazines from the 19th century. The success of Zig Puce in 1925 popularized the use of speech balloons in European comics, after which Franco-Belgian comics began to dominate. The Adventures of Tintin, with its signature clear-line style, was first serialized in newspaper comic supplements beginning in 1929, and became an icon of Franco-Belgian comics. Following the success of Le Journal de Mickey, dedicated comics magazines and full-color comics albums became the primary outlet for comics in the mid-20th century. As in the U.S., at the time comics were seen as infantile and a threat to culture and literacy. Commentators stated that none bear up to the slightest serious analysis, and that comics were the sabotage of all art and all literature. In the 1960s, the term bande dessinée copywriters came into wide use in French to denote the medium. Cartoonists began creating comics for mature audiences, and the term ninth art was coined, as comics began to attract public and academic attention as an art form. Creators such as Rena copyright Goscinny and Jean Giraud published their work in magazines such as Pilot and Ma copyright Al Hurlant. Towards the end of the 20th century, serialization became less common as the number of comics magazines decreased, and many comics began to be published directly as comics albums. Smaller publishers such as L'Association that published longer works in non-traditional formats by auteuristic creators also became common. Since the 1990s, mergers resulted in fewer large publishers, while smaller publishers proliferated. Sales overall continued to grow despite the trend towards a shrinking print market. Japanese comics. Japanese comics and cartooning have a history that has been seen as far back as the anthropomorphic characters in the 13th century template, Tran, 17th century Toba-e and Kaibayashi picture books, and woodblock prints such as ukiyo-e which were popular between the 17th and 20th centuries. The Kaibayashi contained examples of sequential images, movement lines, and sound effects. Illustrated magazines for Western expatriates introduced Western-style satirical cartoons to Japan in the late 19th century. New publications in both the Western and Japanese styles became popular, and at the end of the 1890s, American-style newspaper comic supplements began to appear, as well as some American comic strips. 1900 saw the debut of the jji manga in the Jji Shinpa newspaper, the first use of the word manga in its modern sense, and where, in 1902, Rakuten Kitazawa began the first modern Japanese comic strip. By the 1930s, comic strips were serialized in large circulation monthly girls and boys magazine, and collected into hardback volumes. The modern era of comics in Japan began after World War II, propelled by the success of the serialized comics of the prolific Osamu Tezuka, and the comic strip Suzuki-san. Genres and audiences diversified over the following decades, with comics aimed at shonen and shoujo audiences making up the most significant markets. Comics are usually first serialized in magazines which are often hundreds of pages thick and may over a dozen stories. They are later compiled in tankōbon format books. At the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, nearly a quarter of all printed material in Japan was comics. Translations became extremely popular in foreign markets, in some cases equaling or surpassing the sales of domestic comics. Forms and formats. Comic strips are generally short, multi-panel comics that traditionally most commonly appeared in newspapers. In American comic strips, daily strips have normally occupied a single tier, while Sunday strips have been given multiple tiers. In the early 20th century, daily strips were typically in black and white, while Sundays were usually in color and often occupied a full page. Specialized comics periodicals formats vary greatly in different cultures. Comic books, primarily in American format, are thin periodicals usually published in color. European and Japanese comics are frequently serialized in magazines monthly or weekly in Europe, and usually black and white and weekly in Japan. Japanese comics magazine typically run to hundreds of pages. Book-length comics take different forms in different cultures. European comics albums are most commonly printed in A4-sized color volumes. In English-speaking countries, bound volumes of comics are called graphic novels, and are available in various formats. Despite incorporating the term novel, a term normally associated with fiction, graphic novel also refers to non-fiction and collections of short works. Japanese comics are collected in volumes called tankōbon following magazine serialization. Gag and editorial cartoons usually consist of a single panel, often incorporating a caption or speech balloon. Definitions of comics which emphasize sequence usually exclude gag, editorial, and other single-panel cartoons. They can be included in definitions that emphasize the combination of word and image. Gag cartoons first began to proliferate in broadsheets published in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the term cartoon was first used to describe them in 1843 in the British humour magazine Punch. Weak comics are comics that are available on the Internet. They are able to reach large audiences, and new readers usually can access archived installments. Weak comics can make use of an infinite canvas, meaning they are not constrained by size or dimensions of a page. Some consider storyboards and wordless novels to be comics. Film studios, especially in animation, often use sequences of images as guides for film sequences. These storyboards are not intended as an end product, and are rarely seen by the public. Wordless novels are books which use sequences of captionless images to deliver a narrative, normally one image to a page. Comics studies. Similar to the problems of defining literature and film, no consensus has been reached on a definition of the comics medium, and attempted definitions and descriptions have fallen prey to numerous exceptions. Theorists such as tar paragraph PFFER, R.C. Harvey, Will Eisner, David Carrier, Alan Ray, and Lawrence Grove emphasize the combination of text and images, though there are prominent examples of pantomime comics throughout its history. Other critics, such as Thierry Groenstein and Scott McCloud, have emphasized the primacy of sequences of images. Towards the close of the 20th century, different cultures' discoveries of each other's comics traditions, the rediscovery of forgotten early comics forms, and the rise of new forms made defining comics a more complicated task. European comics studies began with tar paragraph PFFER's theories of his own work in the 1840s, which emphasized panel transitions and the Viziala-Euro-verbal combination. No further progress was made until the 1970s. Pierre Freyssnalt-Tyrwell then took a semiotics approach to the study of comics, analyzing text-to-Euro-image relations, page-level image relations, and image discontinuities, or what Scott McCloud later dubbed closure. In 1987, Henri Venlier introduced the term multicade, or multiframe, to refer to the comics a page as a semantic unit. By the 1990s, theorists such as Benoit registered trademark T. Peters and Thierry Groenstein turned attention to artists' poetic creative choices. Thierry Smolderen and Harry Morgan have held relativistic views of the definition of comics, a medium that has taken various, equally valid forms over its history. Morgan sees comics as a subset of les littératures copyright ratches dessiner copyrightes. French theory has come to give special attention to the page, in distinction from American theories such as McCloud's which focus on panel-to-panel transitions. Since the mid-2000s, Neil Cohn has begun analyzing how comics are understood using tools from cognitive science, extending beyond theory by using actual psychological and neuroscience experiments. This work has argued that sequential images and page layouts both use separate rule-bound grammars to be understood that extend beyond panel-to-panel transitions and categorical distinctions of types of layouts, and that the brain's comprehension of comics is similar to comprehending other domains, such as language and music. The first historical overview of Japanese comics was Seiki Hosokibara's Nihon Mangashi in 1924. Early post-war Japanese criticism was mostly of a left-wing political nature until the 1986 publication Futoma Fusaku's Modern Manga, The Complete Picture, which de-emphasized politics in favor of formal aspects, such as structure and a grammar of comics. The field of manga studies increased rapidly, with numerous books on the subject appearing in the 1990s. Formal theories of manga have focused on developing a manga expression theory, with emphasis on spatial relationships and the structure of images on the page, distinguishing the medium from film or literature, in which the flow of time is the basic organizing element. Comics studies courses have proliferated at Japanese universities, and Japan Society for Studies in Cartoon and Comics (JAR) was established in 2001 to promote comics scholarship. Coulton War attempted the first comprehensive history of American comics with the comics. Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art and Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics were early attempts in English to formalize the study of comics. David Carrier's The Aesthetics of Comics was the first full-length treatment of comics from a philosophical perspective. Prominent American attempts at definitions of comics include Eisner's, McCloud's, and Harvey's. Eisner described what he called sequential art as the arrangement of pictures or images and words to narrate a story or dramatize an idea. Scott McCloud defined comics juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence, intended to convey information and/or to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, a strictly formal definition which detached comics from its historical and cultural trappings. R.C. Harvey defined comics as pictorial narratives or expositions in which words usually contribute to the meaning of the pictures and vice versa. Each definition has had its detractors. Harvey saw McCloud's definition as excluding single-panel cartoons, and objected to McCloud's de-emphasizing verbal elements, insisting the essential characteristic of comics is the incorporation of verbal content. Aaron Meskin saw McCloud's theories as an artificial attempt to legitimize the place of comics in art history. Cross-cultural study of comics is complicated by the great difference in meaning and scope of the words for comics in different languages. The French term for comics, bande dessinée copywriters emphasizes the juxtaposition of drawn images as a defining factor, which can imply the exclusion of even photographic comics. The term manga is used in Japanese to indicate all forms of comics, cartooning, and caricature. Vocabulary and idioms. Panels are individual images containing a segment of action, often surrounded by a border. Prime moments in a narrative are broken down into panels via a process called encapsulation. The reader puts the pieces together by using background knowledge and an understanding of panel relations to combine panels mentally into events, in a process called closure. The size, shape, and placement of panels affect the timing and pacing of the narrative. The contents of a panel may be asynchronous, with events depicted in the same image not necessarily occurring at the same time. Text is frequently incorporated into comics via speech balloons, captions, and sound effects. Speech balloons indicate dialogue, with tails pointing at their respective speakers. Captions can give voice to a narrator, convey characters' dialogue or thoughts, or indicate place or time. Speech balloons themselves are strongly associated with comics, such that the addition of one to an image is sufficient to turn the image into comics. Sound effects mimic non-vocal sounds textually using onomatopoeia sound words. Cartooning is most frequently used in making comics, traditionally using ink with dip pens or ink brushes. Mixed media and digital technology have become common. Cartooning techniques such as caricature, motion lines, and abstract symbols are often employed. While comics are often the work of a single creator, the labor of making them is frequently divided between a number of specialists. There may be a separate writer and artist, or there may be separate artists for the characters and backgrounds. Particularly in American comic books, the art may be divided between a penciler, who lays out the artwork in pencil, an inker, who finishes the artwork in ink, a colorist, and a letterer, who adds the captions and speech balloons. Etymology. The English term comics derives from the humorous work which predominated in early American newspaper comic strips. Usage of the term has become standard for non-humorous works as well. The term comic book has a similarly confusing history. They are most often not humorous. Nor are they regular books, but rather periodicals. It is common in English to refer to the comics of different cultures by the terms used in their original languages, such as manga for Japanese comics, or bande dessinée copywriters for French-language Franco-Belgian comics. Many cultures have taken their words for comics from English, including Russian and German. Similarly, the Chinese term manhua and a Korean main derive from the Chinese characters with which the Japanese term manga is written. See also. See also lists. Notes. References. Works cited, books. Academic journals. Web. Further reading. External links, Comics at DMOZ, Academic Journals, The Comics Grid, Journal of Comics Scholarship, Image Text Interdisciplinary Comics Studies, Image, and Narrative, International Journal of Comic Art, Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, Archives, Billy Island Cartoon Library and Museum, Michigan State University Comic Art Collection, Comic Art Collection at the University of Missouri, Cartoon Art Museum of San Francisco, Time Archives Collection of Comics, Comics in the National Art Library. Prints and Books. Victoria and Albert Museum. Retrieved March 15, 2011. Databases, Comic Book Database, Grand Comics Database, Index, the Disney Comics Database.